Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating and, frankly, vital topic. It touches on faith, politics, the very idea of religious freedom in America.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex intersection.
We've got a stack of sources here, an in-depth piece from Sojourners, some background from the Interfaith Alliance, and also a summary from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty.
Good range of perspectives there.
And they all center around one specific initiative: the Trump administration's Anti-Christian Biases Task Force.
Right.
So our mission today really is to try and cut through some of the noise, look at the specific claims, the counter-arguments.
And understand what it all means.
Exactly. Understand what this task force actually means for the landscape of religious liberty. We're hoping for those aha moments, to give you a clearer picture without getting too overwhelming.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is how these claims of bias, how they can intersect with actual policy, with historical context, even with public perception. So this deep dive should help us explore not just what happened, but maybe why it matters. Hopefully encouraging you, the listener, to think critically about, well, the implications for religious pluralism and the separation of church and state.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The genesis of this task force. I'm curious, what really sparked its creation? Because our sources seem to point to a pretty specific moment.
They do, yeah. The catalyst was a February executive order from the Trump administration. It was actually titled Eradicating Anti-Christian Bias.
Okay.
And that order then created this task force. Its first meeting, according to the sources we have, basically cataloged incidents from the Biden administration that were supposedly, instances of federal anti-Christian bias.
And this wasn't just like a one-off meeting or something symbolic. The executive order had real administrative reach, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. After that first meeting, Veterans Affairs Secretary Doug Collins, he sent a department-wide email, asking employees to submit any instance of anti-Christian discrimination they'd seen within the VA. He even gave examples like retaliatory actions taken in response to religious holiday observances, or observations of mistreatment for not participating in events or activities inconsistent with Christian views.
So it spread quickly through the agencies.
It really shows how fast that directive filtered down.
Okay, that definitely sets the stage. So once the task force was up and running, what were some of the specific Biden-era examples it pointed to as anti-Christian bias? Because the sources give us some pretty distinct ones that, well, they jump out.
They certainly do. One prominent example was his accusation that the Biden administration was targeting peaceful Christians.
How so?
By charging some anti-abortion protesters.
Okay.
Now, the sources clarify these charges were for violating a 1994 federal law. That law prohibits violent, threatening, damaging, and obstructive conduct intended to injure, intimidate, or interfere with the right to seek, obtain, or provide reproductive health services.
But the administration's executive order framed charging these protesters as anti-Christian bias.
Right. And then there's the whole thing with Transgender Day of Visibility. That got a lot of public attention, didn't it? Created quite a stir.
Indeed it did. The executive order specifically faulted the Biden administration for observing Transgender Day of Visibility on March 31st, 2024.
Because it was Easter Sunday that year.
Exactly. But here's the thing, the critique didn't seem to factor in, or at least didn't mention. Transgender Day of Visibility has been observed on March 31st every year since 2009.
It's 2009. Wow.
Yeah, so that includes all 4 years of Biden's presidency, and importantly, the entire Trump administration as well. The date wasn't picked because it was Easter. It was just a fixed, long-standing observance that happened to coincide that year. That's a fascinating detail. Really important context. And finally, Liberty University. Our sources mentioned their provost, Scott Hicks, actually spoke at the task force's kickoff meeting.
He did.
What was their specific claim of bias?
So Hicks cited Liberty University's $14 million fine. This was for sexual assault-related campus safety violations. He presented this fine as evidence of disparate treatment.
Okay.
But what's crucial to note here, and this is a key detail from the sources, is that he didn't contest the actual safety violations themselves.
Ah, right.
His argument was that the size of the fine, the $14 million, that was the evidence of anti-Christian bias, not the underlying findings.
Okay, so those are the main claims of anti-Christian bias that the task force was focusing on. But as you said, our sources also present this powerful counter-narrative. We've got Christian leaders, legal experts, raising pretty significant questions about the task force's real purpose.
Yes.
What's the core critique there? Because this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Well, one core critique that comes through clearly, especially from the Interfaith Alliance and others, is this argument that the Trump administration seemed to be instrumentalizing Christianity.
Instrumentalizing, meaning?
Essentially using it kind of as a tool, both as a weapon against political opponents, perhaps, and also maybe to reward political supporters. So the argument is it wasn't just about protecting faith neutrally, but about a very specific application of that protection.
And this instrumentalization, it seemed inconsistent, right? I mean, the sources point out that Trump's, let's say, enthusiasm for protecting Christians' freedom seemed limited to supporting the political preferences of his voters.
That's the claim, yeah.
For instance, you have Reverend William Barber II and others praying in the Capitol Rotunda. They were protesting planned federal budget cuts that would harm people facing poverty and hunger, clearly an act motivated by sincere Christian faith convictions.
A clear faith motivation.
But they were arrested for crowding, obstructing, and incommoding because, well, demonstrations in congressional buildings are prohibited by law.
Right.
Our sources really highlight the contrast between that outcome and, say, the pardoning of people prosecuted for blockading abortion clinics. The aha moment here seems to be that religious freedom, in this context, maybe wasn't about protecting all faith practices equally.
Perhaps more about aligning with specific political goals.
Exactly.
And that inconsistency, it extends further. You look at Christian organizations like Church World Service or World Relief. These groups have worked with the government for decades, resettling refugees.
Decades, yeah.
And they do it motivated by a deeply held belief, that the Bible commands welcoming the stranger. But under that administration, their refugee resettlement grants were abruptly terminated, which led to layoffs, halted work. So it raises this important question. If the task force is genuinely about protecting religious practice across the board, why weren't these faith-motivated actions getting similar protection or support? It forces you to examine the definition of religious freedom being used.
Yeah, it really does. This brings us to that significant sign-on letter you mentioned from a diverse group of Christian leaders. What was their overall message about this task force? What stood out to you from their statement?
What really stood out was their clear rejection of the whole premise, the idea that there's widespread persecution of Christians in the United States.
They just didn't buy it.
They argued that using federal government resources for what they called a non-existent threat is, well, a gross misuse of taxpayer money. Especially, they pointed out, given the documented rise in actual bias and hate-based violence against Jewish communities, Muslim communities, and other religious groups.
Right, focusing resources in one place when threats are rising elsewhere.
Exactly. And they expressed a real fear, actually, that this anti-Christian bias task force could itself be weaponized to privilege one particular tradition within Christianity over others.
So ironically, potentially creating anti-Christian bias even while claiming to fight it.
Precisely their concern. It's a pretty powerful critique.
Wow. And this letter, it even connected these claims of anti-Christian bias to something deeper, didn't it? Something that social science research might shed some light on.
Yes, it did. The sources highlight some recent social science research suggesting that these claims, specifically white Christian claims about anti-Christian bias in the U.S., are often associated with the idea of anti-white bias.
Interesting connection.
The study authors basically concluded that, quote, expressing concern for anti-Christian bias can be interpreted as signaling allegiance to white people, and that rallying around anti-Christian bias can serve as a dog whistle, signaling support for people concerned about changes in America's racial makeup.
A dog whistle.
Yeah. This research offers a lens, suggesting that claims of anti-Christian bias can sometimes be perhaps a coded way to signal other broader concerns, particularly around racial demographics. It certainly makes you wonder about the underlying motivations and impacts of a task force like this.
And it's also pointed out, related to that consistency issue, that while the administration was critical of universities, it said failed to protect Jewish students after the October 7th attacks.
Yes.
It apparently said or did little to address the root causes of rising anti-Semitic hatred and violence, like failing to prosecute or increase accountability for groups spreading hate. This feels like another example of that inconsistent application, doesn't it? A selective focus.
Absolutely. It points back to that selectivity. And, the First Amendment's free exercise clause, it protects our right to practice religion. But as courts have established over time, this right isn't absolute. It has limits.
Right. There are boundaries.
Religious practice generally can't violate say, public morals
Yeah.
or override a compelling government interest. There was a Supreme Court case back in 1944, for instance, that held a state could force the inoculation of children even if their parents objected for religious reasons, because the state had an overriding compelling interest in protecting public health and safety. So this selective focus we're discussing, it really highlights the complex interplay between perceived bias, political agendas, and the actual foundational principles of religious freedom. It forces us to ask tough questions about where genuine protection ends and maybe political expediency begins.
So even with sincere religious motivation, there are clear legal lines. The sources make the point that courts have upheld laws allowing people to access reproductive health services without being physically blocked by protesters, even if those protesters are faith-motivated.
Correct.
And similarly, religious protesters bringing their witness to the Capitol Rotunda, like Reverend Barber, they also know the government can arrest them for violating laws against demonstrations there. The fundamental idea being sort of, my freedoms end where they actively infringe on someone else's rights or vital public interests.
Precisely. And this raises that important question again about how religious freedom is defined and protected in a truly diverse society. The sources argue that, from their reading, the Bible doesn't teach that Christians are somehow exempt from earthly laws when following Jesus. In fact, some interpretations suggest you should expect persecution for righteousness' sake. So from that perspective, looking to the government to shield religious practice from all laws or to privilege one faith above others, that's seen less as biblically grounded and more as pursuing a kind of ideological agenda. It's a key distinction the authors want us to consider.
And this related idea of the government trying to define who is a true Christian, that's also seen as deeply problematic in the sources.
Very problematic, yes.
They bring up the danger of co-opting and hijacking the Christian movement. Someone even mentioned Emperor Constantine making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, that kind of historical parallel.
Raising concerns about state entanglement.
Right. They question why we would ever trust the government to decide who counts as a true or real Christian, especially given the huge diversity in belief, tradition, interpretation across Christianity itself.
It's incredibly diverse.
The administration seemed to equate Christians with the faith of specific figures like, say, Reverend Paul White or Reverend Robert Jeffress, maybe leaving out others like Bishop Marion Budd or Bishop William Barber. That's a significant point about who gets represented and who gets to define the faith in the public square.
And the good news here, perhaps, if we look at recent public polling cited in our sources.
Oh, there's polling on this.
Yes. An overwhelming majority of Christians, including, interestingly, 2 out of every 3 white evangelicals, do not support the establishment of a federal task force that focuses exclusively on discrimination against Christians rather than discrimination against all religions.
That's a really high number, 2 out of 3 white evangelicals.
It is. It suggests that the concerns of those who champion religious pluralism and freedom for everyone resonate pretty broadly, even within groups, sometimes perceived differently. It kind of emphasizes the need for what one source called the often quiet majority to maybe become louder in their commitment to genuine religious pluralism for all.
So after all that, what does this all mean? We've looked at the Trump administration's creation of this anti-Christian bias task force. We examined the specific incidents it cited, the charges against anti-abortion protesters, the timing of Transgender Day of Visibility, that university fine.
The core examples they put forward.
But we also heard from this diverse group of Christian leaders and legal experts who raised pretty critical questions, didn't they?
Yeah.
About the task force's real purpose, its potential to actually undermine religious freedom for all, highlighting those inconsistencies and how principles were applied.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, I think this deep dive really surfaces a fundamental question. How do we define and protect religious freedom in a society as diverse as ours? It really highlights the complexities, doesn't it? Making sure the government protects the rights of all people to practice their faith, or indeed no faith at all, without privileging one tradition over others, and without using faith as some kind of ideological tool. Understanding that dynamic seems crucial for anyone trying to navigate that intersection of faith and public life today.
Absolutely. So as we leave you to mull over this deep dive, maybe consider this. In a nation that was, in many ways, built on the ideal of religious freedom, what is the ultimate responsibility? For faith leaders, for citizens, for all of us, really. How do we ensure that this freedom truly extends to everyone, and not just perhaps to those whose beliefs happen to align with the prevailing political winds of the moment?
Critical question to ponder.
Something to think about until next time.